Welcome to Redefining Engagement. I'm Francesca Dumar, Director of Audience Development and Strategy at Contribly. And in this show, I speak to leaders and innovators in the media industry so that we can bring tips, wisdom, ideas, and even some things to avoid so that we can all do more engagement better. So without further ado, let's move on to our next guest. So Cecilia, thank you so much for agreeing to have a little chat with us. And how about you start with a little intro, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to be here. I'm Cecilia Campbell. I am a journalist originally, and I've sort of been a meta journalist because I've been working for the World Association of News Publishers since the late 90s, basically, writing about the industry, also being very involved in particularly in a reader revenue group during the 2010s, where we had publishers from all over the world, and we would have 2 meetings a year and sitting, people like the New York Times, or we went to Bild in Germany, all over the place. So I got a lot of input then about where publishers were at, and then I lived in England at the time. I moved back to Sweden. I have been working with UnitedRobots in Sweden. So that's tech. Well, we're not quite a startup anymore. We're a bit further along, but we provide automated content for local newsrooms specifically. So it's quite a niche thing. And it was obviously when we started in 2016 and I started in 2018, when you said robot journalism, it was like, people did not want to know. We don't call it robot journalism anymore because it really isn't. It's about automating sort of community information. So we use the old school AI, you could say. We take big data sets and we use natural language generation to turn them into small news texts. But it's not a robot writing. It's more like a very sophisticated template system, you could say. So all the text segments have been written by humans first, not by robots. Anyway, so my answers will probably reflect what we do. And then a year ago, I also co-founded a new group within One IFRA called Innovate Local, because I have been working so much with local newsrooms, and you see there's a lot of challenges, but there's also very many unique opportunities, I think, which excites me a lot. Like, democracy starts locally. And local journalism needs to reflect that. And in some quarters, we kind of lost our way a little bit, but I think there is such a major opportunity for local if it's done right. And audience engagement is, of course, a big part of that, I think.
You've got such a variety of experience because you've obviously worked with next to national news, but also hyperlocal. So I'm really excited to hear your insights in terms of that, like audience engagement piece. I guess it goes straight into my first question, which is, what does audience engagement mean to you?
To me, because I look at the local angle, and it's about being valuable and relevant to local people. That's what I think. But it's not, it's about what you as a publisher, what you do for the audience. It's not about what the audience does for you. And in a way, when you talk about audience engagement, it's sort of something that you want, readers are engaging with you so that you can do this and that and the other. But you have to look at it from the reader's point of view, I think. So it's about what you can do for them. And to me, it's about creating journalism that kind of brings them back and creates real value in their life. And answer that user needs, to talk about another very sort of recent development in newsrooms. So yeah, I think it's audience engagement. You need to think about what you can do for readers. That's where it starts.
That user-centric kind of model is something that keeps coming up. It's a word that's talked about again and again, especially now. But then I'm guessing your definition of what audience engagement might have changed in the last few years until you got to this point, or has it not at all?
It kind of has a little bit, I would say, but then I think about it and I kind of come back to the same point again. But I've seen it if we go back 15 years, I've been seeing it very much through the lens of reader revenues and the customer journey there. Because, of course, if you don't create engagement, you're not going to, drive conversions. You need to drive retention by creating engagement with your readers. But now with Innovate Local, I think it becomes a little bit more profound in a way. I mean, in a certain sense of that word. It's about actually becoming an indispensable part of your local readers' lives, to prove your value, seeing in your readers' lives and actually having a place there that they value. Yeah. Yeah.
And in your experience, what aims would you say that this audience engagement delivers on? Why should news brands be doing more engagement?
Ultimately, I think it's sort of existential for media. Like if you don't engage local people, again, local, what reason do you have to exist? I mean, what is the point, and how are you going to survive? I really think it's existential. I just think journalism is all about engagement. You still want to provide something that is of value to them. So that, again, engagement and value are very closely connected, I think.
I might go down the hyperlocal route really quickly, because it gives us a bit of context. But in terms of like engagement, what would you say the hurdles are? Like, what do you think is stopping news brands from engaging with their audiences better? What in your definition of providing that value?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think first, there's one thing to say first, I think, and because I've thought a lot about this over the years, there's so often you see these new reports about, consumer research or, even like the Reuters report and things like that. And it shows that people are unwilling to pay for news. But to me, like, why are you stopping there? Why are you throwing your hands in there? Oh, they're not willing to pay for local news. I mean, clearly there's probably something that they would be willing to pay for. Start looking at what it is you could provide that they would be willing to pay for. That to me is like, I don't think that question is being asked often enough. I think a big hurdle is there's too much inside out thinking in this industry. Like, okay, we have these journalists, they have these egos, they want to do this or whatever. Obviously that's just a huge generalization, but you need to have senior management that are really willing to look at things in a new way. You can't do it the way it always has been done. And I think newsrooms that really reflect the communities that they serve in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that should not, DEI should not be an activity. It should really be at the core. I think that's a major starting point for engagement. Really.
It's interesting because based on what you just said, I could almost argue that maybe there's a place for people who aren't journalists in our industry to come in and mix the stuff up a bit. I'm kind of hearing that from you a little bit, but maybe I'm wrong.
We had there was a guy at, I went to Newsgeist, which is one of Google's events last year. And we did a local conference session there, and he was from Italy, and he said, when we hire people, the main point is that they have to live in the community. So not that they're a journalist, that's secondary. So they'd hired a real estate agent in one village just to cover that community. I mean, that's not exactly DEI, but there are new ways of thinking about things, I think.
That's a fantastic example.
Right? It's crazy. But it makes sense to me.
Like, he must have done such a different way of approaching every single job. I love it. I absolutely love it.
I'm sure, you still have to really be careful with the journalistic standards and everything like that. Needless to say. I am a journalist. But I do think, and it's the same thing, when you hear a 45-year-old, senior editor saying, "Oh, we're doing stuff for young people because we've set up a TikTok channel." that it's not about the channel. It's about how you speak to people. Who is running that channel? If it's a 35-year-old, you're not doing it. Technically it's there, but it has to come from people. You have to be with the community that you're serving. I think that's super important locally, because it's a harder sell in some ways, because the main news, of course, are covered by lots of other people. But there are things as a local news outlet or as a local journalism outlet that obviously will be unique to you. And the more local you are, the more unique you will be, and the more valuable and engaging you will be, I think.
There's definitely a niche in the hyperlocal. That is the personalization in a sense, definitely.
Yeah.
And what about in terms of strategies? Let's look at strategies, best practices. Have you ever seen any that have proven more effective in your experience?
I think it's the same theme, of course, again, but like get closer to your readers. There was an interesting case by a Norwegian group called Media that they were part of our EREV group, Reader Revenue group, for many years. And they had really re-examined how they did local journalism. And like a concrete example was, instead of going and reporting on the local council meeting in the town hall, well, of course, you can report on that. But the main story is not that. The main story is about the person who is really affected. So by the decision, so you get as close to the sort of the source as possible. Don't write about the political decision, write about the people, the story about how it affects the people in your community. And I mean that they have hard figures on that driving conversions and engagement, So I think get closer to your readers is a really important one.
There's a bit of two-way engagement for you to be able to do that. You have to know your community really well. So you're broadcasting out, but you're also trying to find ways of bringing those stories and that interaction in.
Absolutely.
Which isn't easy to do, especially, now that we've got less and less journalists a lot of the time. I think in this world where we are looking at this two-way engagement, what would you say at what point in the process should we considering the audience, and how does that take shape in your ideal world?
I do think it should just sort of be done from the point of where you start to plan the stories. You think about the user needs and how you cover the stories from the very early. Like, it should never be an afterthought, like, oh, we have to cover this now. Oh, and how should we drive engagement? No, how should we write about this? For what different groups are affected, in what different ways, and how can we cover it for them? It's not, it's not a point in the process. It's part of everything.
And in terms of, you've seen a lot of brands, you've worked with a lot of brands. Do you have any successful initiatives, or can you think of any that have significantly boosted engagement? What did you think made it successful?
I mean, my absolute favorite case ever, I think, is a Norwegian title called Stavanger Aftenblad, and they are part of of Schibsted in Norway. So it's a regional title in a pretty big for Norwegian standards, big city, but it's still it's local, And they decided to start covering local football like it's the Champions League. Okay, that was the reader promise. All the divisions, and including junior football. So what they did was they built a text robot similar to ones we use at UnitedRobots, but not with us, but with the Norwegian news agency who had the data. They had all the results. So that meant that they could cover all the matches, every single match. And most of them were written by the robots, but they were all there with the names of the scorers and the coaches and all of that. They had two full-time journalists who then are out at the matches doing interviews, streaming some of them, like really visible in the community. And they set up a whole vertical. So if you go on their website, there is one called, it's goal in Norwegian, mål, it's called. So you go there, you see all the matches. It's really created a community around this vertical. And so it really improved engagement, because for every match, you don't have loads of audience, but you have some very, very, very engaged people who are, like the grandfathers and the best friends of whoever is playing. And so you get really involved readers, plus the fact then that all the automation meant that these two journalists were out in the community, they were visible, so they're helping build the Stavanger Aftenblad brand for the future. And they actually drove conversions with much younger people than they had the average subscriber was. So it's like an all-around fantastic case, I think. Elin Sturland, who was the project manager, she's still looking after it now. She was our first webinar at the Innovate Local series this spring. And there's a whole write-up on the Innovate Local website. I recommend it for anybody who thinks about community journalism.
I'll make sure I put the link in so that anyone can find that, because that's such a beautiful story.
Isn't it? So good.
It touches you, and I think that's part of, like, we as humans, we make our decisions based on emotion, even though we don't think we do. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that makes it feel so special, isn't it? Like, I was a normal person playing football, and all of a sudden now I'm in the local newspaper every week, and I'm a star, and my granddad thinks I am, and everybody does. And it's, if we can create that in more areas and not just sport, I think that would be really exciting, especially when it comes to local. I love that.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why local has so many opportunities, I think, that you can't get on a national level. There are other opportunities nationally, obviously, but that one is a good one, I think.
Love it. Do you have any examples of audience engagement that has surprised you the most?
It shouldn't be surprising, but I have to say one of our other webinars this spring was around good old-fashioned investigative journalism. And it's not even done in any particularly fancy way, but it's a Borgars Tidning in Sweden. They have a team of 3 women reporters on the investigative team. And I only mention the women because they actually think it makes a difference, because female sources are probably open up more to them than they would to men, because some of these cases is, it's about sexual harassment or whatever. And they dig up big stories. And generally speaking, in Sweden, investigative journalism is really on the up in local media. And people are finding, I've heard this from several other publishers, it's really helping them drive conversions. So I think and even with young people, I think it's a really good starting place, because, I mean, Gen Z especially, and I have a son who's 17, they are idealists, they believe in right and wrong and things like that. And I think that could be really a good starting point for somebody who wants to get more serious about reaching young audiences.
That's fascinating. There's a whole world of documentaries. There's a whole world of investigation. Yeah. It's a different side to it, isn't it? And in what way do you think we should be personalizing content to increase engagement among different audiences? You mentioned your 17-year-old son. Do you think that we need to be personalizing the content in a different way? Like, when you imagine him, what does that look like in your mind?
I'm not sure there's anything that can be done for him.
Maybe not for him then.
I mean, well, if we're just going to mention him, like, he gets everything from TikTok, but it's not like he's on the New York Times on TikTok. There are so many people who kind of act as journalists on TikTok, and I mean, from what I've seen, it's not all bad, I don't even know where to begin with that, really. But I do think, and at UnitedRobots, we definitely see it's not personalization, but again, it's that hyper local. That if you can really get the stories closest to home, to the right people, then that'll drive engagement a lot. So for example, with house sales, which is a huge, buying and selling property is a big thing in people's lives. And if you can talk about the properties that have sold in their neighborhood, that really becomes valuable to them and relevant to them.
It's almost across demographics. It's what are the subjects in terms of local that really bring people together, that make and that they see themselves in.
Yeah, and I tell you another one that we have that's unfortunately we only been able to set up in Norway and Sweden because of data issues with UnitedRobots. But we write summaries of annual reports from local companies, and both in Norway and Sweden, it doesn't matter how small your company is, you still have to publicly declare your books, right? And so suddenly there's a stream of stories, and often the newsrooms have not heard of half of these companies. But if you look beneath the numbers, you can find these really amazing stories, and it's always somebody's, employer, or you own the company, or it's actually your local shop or whatever. It touches everybody, and that's been like, it's not exactly personalized, but it's very, very tightly knit to the small local communities, And there's another example I have that which we had during the Innovate local session at a World News Media Congress in Copenhagen, and that's Crosstown. I don't know if you've heard of them. They came out of the Annenberg School of Journalism at USC in Los Angeles, and basically it was a couple of journalism professors plus a PhD engineering student who built the platform. They take publicly available data and they built a platform which basically turns any journalist into a data journalist. You can slice and dice the data in any way you want, which is half of the solution. And the other half is that they have created a newsletter platform. So they'll write a newsletter, and then the data is filled in on neighborhood levels. So there's 114 different neighborhoods in LA, and each of them get a newsletter with, the COVID data, the traffic data, the whatever it is, crime data specifically for them. And they've achieved over 90% open rate on those.
Wow.
It's an amazing case. That's another one. It's also on our website. We had them at Congress, so that's written up. It's super interesting. And I can't understand. I mean, they're now, yes, because it's only your neighborhood. And of course you want to know, and they also, they flip it around. Like there was a story about Lady Gaga's French bulldog getting kidnapped or dog-napped or whatever. And they asked the question, is this part of a bigger trend? So they started looking at dog napping data, kidnapping data for dogs. And they could see that actually, particularly French bulldogs went missing a lot. And so it's that story is really interesting. And they've now decided to, they've been non-profit, but I think they've kind of put themselves up for sale. And if I had the money, I'd buy them, I tell you. It's a really amazing platform.
Well, let's see if anyone listening to this kind of turns around and goes, I guess you're leading on to my next question, which is around tech, because, we talk about the data, we're talking about engagement, but the technology that we use, it plays a key part in dealing with all of this. What role do you see, you've talked about AI, but what role does technology and analytics and data analytics play in this audience engagement efforts? Do you think that we're there? Where do you see it going?
I mean, I think Crosstown is a fantastic first example of how building this tech that can turn every local journalist into a data journalist. I mean, that would be data analytics it's the gold mine for local stories. I mean, it's the kind of local stories that local publishers have been covering for years, but just not in a very systematic way. And now, with this type of platform, they can look at. It turns out that there are news deserts right in LA. Neighborhoods that don't get covered because not the right people live there. It's about inclusivity again. And so I think that's a really if access to local data and turning that into stories, that would be a fantastic start.
Even within that, there is a lot of data, but there's not necessarily, there are some parts where the data is not necessarily telling the story or the right story. And part of that is the feedback from the audience to understand, where does that go? I'm guessing.
Yeah.
How would you integrate that feedback and the interaction with the data that's being received, within that content creation process?
Yeah, I don't know how Crosstown does it really, if they do it. I know we have one client, McClatchy, in the States, and they started doing automated real estate content from us, and they had an email, please give us your opinion about this. And the email went straight to the senior vice president of the company, because she was like, this is important stuff. I think they put it there just in case people were upset about it, or, always, why are you using robots and that kind of stuff. But what it turned out was that most people were very enthusiastic about it, because suddenly they were seeing there was high school sports as well from their local high school. But what about this other high school? Can you cover that as well? I mean, people were asking for more things through that. So, but I do believe, I think that, like you say, the two-way communication with the communities, there's a lot to be done still there. And if you don't, it's no good sitting in the newsroom deciding that you're going to do these stories. You need to be out there and finding the stories and communicating with people. And I mean, that's where automation comes in. If we go back to tech, if you can use automation to free up journalists, and like our media does that in Norway, all of our clients do that. They can spend more time actually out in the community, away from their desk. And that has to be an ultimate goal for engagement, I think.
I love that example. I think that would be one of my surprising examples, is, people coming back and saying, we want more. Like, you're not giving us enough.
Yeah.
It's great. And straight up to the vice president, that makes a huge difference. That's
She's senior vice president now.
Senior vice president now. That is dedication, really.
Yeah, I think they were very serious about that, for sure.
So, and what do you think? Let's talk a little bit about the future of audience engagement.
Yeah.
Where do you see the future of audience engagement heading? I was going to say between the next 5 to 10 years, but 10 feels a bit much. So maybe
it's hard to know.
The next 5 years, where do you see it going?
I mean, I think, like I've said in the beginning, I really think it's about being valuable in people's lives. And I do think that quality journalism, like service journalism, impact journalism is a thing that people talk about now, actually showing how our journalism is changing what's going on in your local community, or the decisions that are being made. And investigative journalism. I do think that they will win the day, including for young people, creating journalism with and for your readers. That is, but then I think the next step is, as we've discussed as well, how can you then, having gained that trust and being an important part of people's lives, how can you start actually taking things back in from them and including them in a more active way, which isn't just comments or whatever, I mean, in America, they're almost in a sort of a post-newspaper world. They're heading that way. There's so many digital news startups that are more about community in a way, and not... The contrast in America is extreme also with the big groups, or some of the big groups that are owned by VCs, and every site looks the same, no matter where you are. There are a few local stories, but then there's all the other stuff that's the same all across the country. It's a very big contrast to the newer, smaller digital news outlets that actually are of their communities in a different way.
And I keep playing back what you said earlier about any journalist becoming a data journalist, and in that case, they didn't need the skills to do it necessarily. But skills is something that we need to talk about when we talk about journalists all the time, especially when we're going into, using tech for audience, for the data side, for audience engagement side. What skills do you think media journalists need to be focusing on in this new future that we're going into?
Yeah, there are a lot of things that probably are useful. And I do think just really the core journalism skills, and including working with data. But beyond that, I really feel like, and I'm just trying to think of my own journalism training, it was quite formulaic in a way. But I feel like it's all about imagination, listening skills, empathy, like understanding people, And again, I think it's very key that newsrooms reflect the communities they serve. You know, journalism is about people. It's about the people who produce it. It's about the people who consume it. And when there's a real connection, you get engagement. And I think that's what it's all about. So I don't remember doing any like interview, techniques and things like that very much. It's like you knew what you were supposed to get, and that's what they sent you out to do. But I think it's a lot about human skills in a way, which
I think so many people thinking about the digital.
And also
sorry.
I mean, with generative AI, you know, this is where you differentiate yourself. It's on that human connection. That's where that's something the robots can never do. So
that's such a fantastic answer, because it's so opposite to what everyone would potentially expect. Everyone expects you to need to be better at digital and better at data and better, but actually the creativity and the differentiation is that human. I totally agree. I couldn't agree more. And especially now that young people are always on their social media, they need to get used to, you know, they're probably not engaging as much, and it's a skill that's so needed outside in the outside world, talking to people in a bar, just being able to do that without any issues. It's
seriously face to face, you know. At least my 17-year-old is good at that too. So
and one last question for you. If you had to give a hack to anybody that's going into the media world or going into trying to start engaging with their audience, what would be the hack that you would give?
Be yourself, be a human, and dare to connect with people. Don't have like this. I mean, of course, you have to have the journalistic integrity, but I don't think that means you can't be a fellow human being. It's not a hack. It's just don't try too hard, you know, like actually listen to what people are saying. I think that's so important.
Absolutely love that. Can't agree more. Thank you so much, Cecilia. That was fantastic. I really appreciate your time.